a few years back, we saw a lot of people in the truth and freedom community go deep into the topic of studying history, real history. And they have connected dots in a way that they were never connected before. They've looked at hidden and lost empires. They've looked at regular resets that seem to happen. And as a matter of fact, they came so close to a critical mass point that apparently, and all of a sudden, all hell broke loose on this planet, on Earth, with the extreme measurements that were taken in reaction to something called COVID. And of course, everything else is kind of history. So all of this, whether that's Tartaria, the mud flood, it's kind of died down for a while. And it's really, really gaining interest again because this is so important, especially because, of course, over the last 2.5 years, people have been familiarized with the term the Great Reset. So what is history? Okay, so we all kind of suspected that history and the way we were taught in school was distorted, was changed, altered. But what we, I think, never really saw up until recently, when I say recently, past few years, is it might have been completely fabricated as we know it. And this is a big statement, but let's go a little bit into it. So yes, we do live in a simulation, but what does that really mean? If we are disconnected from the true origins, from true history, then we live in an artificial bubble as we perceive reality today. So that in and of itself makes it a simulation. What really happened before we were born and our parents were born and grandparents were born? What happened, for example, in America? The official history is that in 1492, a guy named Columbus accidentally landed here, discovered America, and then a lot of wars, genocides, and conflicts later, we find ourselves in 2022, and we look around, it was all a natural progression, blah, blah, blah. I call BS. I call bullshit on that. That definitely, none of that is true. None of that happened that way. But does it go deeper than that? Was it just little facts that were changed? I don't think so. I think the whole thing was really invented. Here's an interesting article from 1851. And they write, it's an article, I believe that was from Pennsylvania, from a newspaper. Architecture, sculpture, painting, and all the arts that adorn civilized life have flourished in this country at a period far remote. There is evidence sufficient to prove that these cities were in ruins at least 16 or 1800 years ago. A dark shade rests on the antiquities of America, and a few rays of light and live in the gloom. We have ancient history to inform us of the events of Egypt, how that empire was founded and how it prospered and fell. We have the same record of Babylon, Greece, and others, but not the least information have we relative to those who erected these cities, what people and whence they came, not a ray of light to dispel the dark gloom which seems to rest on this excellent history of America. Interesting. Interesting how that was seen in 1851. What cities are they talking about? Well, as I said, more evidence appears that there are great resets happening, mass depopulations and repopulations on Earth. And if we look at America, this becomes more and more evident. Today, in the big cities, I can tell you this, like here in Nashville and other places, there's always a very interesting observation. When all these new construction sites in the cities are being excavated and the big holes are being made because they're putting garages in and big foundations, you know what they so often find? They find that the buildings that are on the surface actually have multiple layers, multiple levels going deeper in. Now you might say that's nothing special. They might have something like a cellar or something like a basement, but that's not it. These buildings have multiple layers of windows and doors underneath the earth, underneath the dirt, underneath the surface. You can find this in every major city, and one wonders what happened to these buildings and how come that portions of these buildings are completely covered in mud or dirt. Was there a flood? Did that happen? And how did it happen all over the world? Now, these are very interesting questions, but let's stick to America here for a little bit. It's not just that buildings are hidden underneath, is that we find structures that we simply cannot explain. We find systems that we cannot explain. We can't explain San Francisco and how the underground systems are built. We can't even explain how New York's deep underground systems were really built and how it happened that fast and how sophisticated given the apparently limited technology. But there's another thing that's very, very strange. America has had the world's fastest, largest, and weirdest series of great fires. And that happened in the 1800s. Within a few short decades, all the major cities have seen the Great Fire. That's what they call it. The Great Fire of Boston, of Detroit, Atlanta, of Chicago, of Philadelphia, and on and on and on the list goes. So many great fires, and so often in these great fires, the historic districts were destroyed and then replaced with modern, ugly buildings. This is what has happened over and over and over again. As a matter of fact, when we really look at the absolutely stunning architecture that you can still find in some places in the United States, you must ask yourself, how does it all fit together? And why does this architecture not really represent what we should have seen in that time period? One huge hint are the World's Fairs. Now, if you dive into this topic, the World's Fairs, the expositions, especially in North America, you will be absolutely floored. Let's look at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. Here's a little bit of the official history according to Wikipedia. The World's Columbian Exposition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair, was a World's Fair held in Chicago in 1893 to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the New World in 1492. The exposition covered 690 acres, featuring nearly 200 new but deliberately temporary buildings of predominantly neoclassical architecture, canals and lagoons, and people and cultures from 46 countries. More than 27 million people attended the exposition during its 6-month run. Now, they always emphasize that these buildings were temporary, but please look at these images. Just look at the stunning architecture. Look at the monumental size of this. Look at the beauty. Look at the perfect proportions. Are you really telling me that in 1890, that's when Chicago was awarded the honor of being the city that was going to host this exposition, that in 1890, they started building this, the thing that you see here, and it was finished in 1893. Are you telling me that they put all this up in 3 years? They tell us they built it with temporary materials, not permanent materials, not stone. They also tell us it was all but 2 buildings were destroyed later, like with all the other expositions. And even though those were temporary buildings, you could see people standing on them, on the balconies. You could see people walking in them. You could see people using them just like any other building. Also, all the electricity that was used, it was all illuminated by night. It looked absolutely stunning. It is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And what they tell us is that after the exposition was over, which was a huge success, although the mayor got killed and there was another murderer at the exposition, a lot of other scandals, everything got torn down. Also, they tell us that these expositions, these World's Fairs, were to introduce human innovation and technologies to the world. So this didn't just happen in Chicago. These expositions happened in St. Louis. They happened in San Francisco. They happen to happen in Nashville. And sometimes they come up with the weirdest stories. In Nashville, for example, this is here, our backyard. They built the Tennessee Centennial Exposition. Also, beautiful park, beautiful buildings, beautiful landscaping, everything. And then they tore everything down, but they actually, instead of keeping the Parthenon, the Nashville Parthenon, keeping it in a temporary material, some plaster and other stuff, they turned it into stone, into permanent material. And that's why we today see this building. If you ask me, these stories are so unbelievable. They're so crazy. They're so ludicrous. What I really believe is that these beautiful buildings, these structures, this architecture, and so much of it is also housing technology, was already in place. And these expositions happened after the Great Reset, when, I think, this is my theory, when America was repopulated, the cities were repopulated, and they used these expositions to have a trail that is kind of logical for historians to look at later. They bring in inventions. I mean, they showed the electric vehicle. They showed the predecessor of the fax machine already. They showed a handheld wireless communication device. That sounds familiar. So I think what they were doing is kind of fast tracking technology, because otherwise it just wouldn't make sense. The technological leaps we've had in the last 100 years or so, they just don't make sense. The growth is so exponential. It, of course, does make sense when all of this technology was already ready and was just being fast-tracked over the last 100 years. Now, these fairs have happened in so many cities, and the story is always the same. It is absolutely stunning. But what is also stunning is that the architectural problems that we see today, they didn't just happen, or the discrepancies in the exposition cities, they happen everywhere else too. I mean, there's something like the Corn Palace in Sioux City that was also built for a corn exposition and then torn down. A stunning, stunning building. And you can see this over and over and over again. This story is repeating all across North America. Now, I have, over the last years, asked myself multiple questions. One of the big questions was, why did the government insist on the most horrific treatment of the indigenous people here, of the American Indians or the Native Americans, including not just taking their land, including taking and banning and outlawing their religion, banning them from practicing their rituals, practicing their language, practicing their oral traditions. I think the reason why this was so heavily and so horrifically done is so that they could not transport the knowledge into today's days and age, where they could tell us that there have been other civilizations aside from them here before that build cities, that build structures, that build all of this. And now they can't tell us, or sometimes there's a little bit left, but a lot of that knowledge seems to be all but gone. And I think that was one of the huge reasons, because you cannot have a true connection to the real past. Then there were other things that I began to connect over the past few years. There's an interesting executive order that was made on the day of the winter solstice of 2020. So December 21, 2020, the executive order on promoting beautiful federal civic architecture. And I want to show you something. And this is just how it came off the website. What are you noticing here? Even this, even how it's worded, has beautiful proportions and is a beautiful architecture thing. Of course, this executive order was issued by Trump back in 2020, who we know is into classic styles of architecture, but I think he was hinting at more than that. I always wondered what that slogan, "Make America Great Again," means on a deeper level. I understand what it means for most people politically. I understand what it means in terms of economy and all that, but I think it points back to the true history of an empire that existed here that was truly beautiful. I'm not saying it was perfect, but I'm saying truly beautiful. And I believe we see this in this lost architecture of the expositions. We see this in the lost geometry, the sacred geometry that was used everywhere. And I think this was a hint that there is a deeper history there, and that "Make America Great Again" maybe means way more than we can perceive. Why I make that connection is because coincidentally, what we see around these expositions is a huge explosion in the use of electricity. And for that time, it seemed to have been very, very advanced. The way they illuminated buildings, the way they did all of that. Of course, Tesla was around. He's not being mentioned a whole lot, but people who are studying it deeper say that his inventions, his generators, and maybe even his Tesla towers were a big part of these expositions, and maybe even a big part of the old empire that is all but lost now. So what is interesting connection? Who was in charge of examining all the materials, all of Tesla's research after Tesla's death, his good friend, John Trump, Donald Trump's uncle, he was the one, a great physicist, brilliant guy. He was the one who was commissioned by the government to look into all the research of Nikola Tesla. And Donald Trump points to John Trump, his uncle, as a great influence. And so there is much more connection that goes deeper into history, that goes deeper into the true origins of this nation that we can currently perceive. What I am saying is, I think if we don't do our research, if we don't actually uncover all of this, we will not get to the truth of who we are, where we came from, and how far advanced we already were in certain areas. I think this is part of this war that we're in, and as much as we are looking into the future and what needs to be done and what needs to be created and what needs to be envisioned, if we look at our true past, we might actually see that perhaps it wasn't all bad and we weren't just racists and, very bad people and warring people. Perhaps there was a golden age, and it was here not too long ago, and it was a golden age that was then interrupted by something. And now again, we can look at this. So I urge you, look into Tartaria, look into the World's Fairs, look into the architecture. There's so much more to this, and we're gonna go deeper in another video. This is as a starting point to go deeper into the subject.
Yeah.